I lived in Connecticut for 2 years when I was in kindergarten and first grade. Besides that, I've been in Moore, Oklahoma for my upbringing. And I remember this time, my brother was in first grade, and everyone thought we sounded funny because we sound like Okies. And up there, we thought they sounded funny because they sound like Yankees. And his teacher was reading him a story, and it said something along the lines of, and Billy had an idea. But the teacher did not sound like that. It came off as, and Billy had an idea, because up there they pronounce things with an R. And my brother, being the sarcastic boy that he is, shot his hand up and said, she said, Connor. And he said, where's the R? I don't think he really wanted to know where the R was. He was really trying to say, why did you say that incorrectly? I find it fascinating that God in Scripture asks us questions. Not that all-knowing God needs to know something from us, but yet often He asks questions so that we can learn truth, or to see where we are in our relationship with Him, or to see where we need to make changes. And our question is really similarly. It's not God asking questions so that He can learn something, but yet it's God asking us a question in this story to see where are we at, and where is our faith at. And so if you have your Bible, open up to Matthew chapter 8. We're going to be in Matthew chapter 8, starting in verse 23. In the Gospel of Matthew, you can break it down this way. Matthew is trying to get his readers, primarily a Jewish audience, to believe that Jesus is the prophesied Messiah, that He fits all of the prophecies you've heard. This really was the Son of God. And how He does that is He has 5 large teaching sections in the book of Matthew. And in between each teaching section, you find miracle sections. You find where you see Jesus performing signs and wonders that would fit the one who would be the prophesied Messiah. And so in Matthew chapter 8, where we find ourselves is, we've already had the first major teaching section. There's the Sermon on the Mount, and now we find ourselves where Jesus is performing miracles. He's backing up who He is. Here's the evidence that I am the Son of God, and now you're hearing teaching after and before it. So we find ourselves in a miracle section. I want you to read with me starting in verse 23 of Matthew chapter 8. It says there, and when He got into a boat, that being Jesus, His disciples followed Him. And behold, there arose a great storm on the sea, so that the boat was being swamped by the waves, but He was asleep. And they went and woke Him, saying, Save us, Lord, we are perishing. And He said to them, Why are you afraid, O you of little faith? Then He rose and rebuked the winds and the sea, and there was a great calm. And the men marveled, saying, What sort of man is this, that even winds and sea obey Him? Our question that we're looking at of why are you afraid happens on a boat in the middle of the water when there's a great storm surrounding the disciples. But He says, why are you afraid? That question might have been rhetorical. That question might have been answered within the very statement He makes when He says, oh, you of little faith. But I thought about that for a little bit. How would we answer that question when it comes to our big problems in life? When it comes to our trials, our storms, why are we afraid? I thought of there might be multiple reasons these disciples could have answered that question that we would give too. Why are you afraid? Well, first, Jesus, look at the storm. Do you see what's all around us? They are somewhere on the Sea of Galilee. That body of water has a surface area of 64 square miles. It's located 686 feet below sea level. It's 13 miles wide north to south. It is 7 miles wide east to west. It has a maximum depth of 157 feet. If you do not like being in big bodies of water, you can imagine being in the middle of a body of water where it might be 157 feet deep. I might be a little afraid when there's a storm coming around swamping the boat. Here's how the Bible describes this storm. Also, it says in Mark chapter 4, they're on this boat in the evening. We don't know if it's completely dark, if it's getting dark, where we are in the process, but it says it's evening. So the likelihood is they're on a storm, it's getting dark, and it's getting darker. Here's how the Bible describes this storm. It says a great storm hits. Well, that's selling it short a little bit, I would say. The gospel accounts say this. Matthew says the boat was being swamped by the waves. That's a good picture in your head. Mark says that waves were breaking into the boat. Luke would say about this account, water was filling the boat. So they are sinking. They're taking on water. It describes it more this way. Mark and Luke agree. They say a windstorm went down upon the lake. But Matthew doesn't say that. Matthew just says a great storm. And there's something interesting about this, is that the word he uses to describe storm is seismic. There are 4 storms in the New Testament that this word is used for. One of them is Acts chapter 16 with not the Ethiopian eunuch, but the Philippian jailer. Do you remember that story when Paul and Silas are in jail and they're singing hymns in the evening at midnight, and an earthquake happened and the doors were unfastened and all the prisoners are free, yet none of them had escaped? And they go on to end up baptizing this jailer and his whole household. Same word for that earthquake. Matthew chapter 27. When Jesus was crucified, and we see the phrase from the centurion who says, surely this was the Son of God. And it says the earth shook and the veil was torn. Same word. One chapter later, in Matthew chapter 28, before the stone was rolled away, when resurrected Jesus would rise up from death, it says the earth shook. That's the same word used to describe this storm. Now, I'm not telling you today that this was an earthquake while they were on the body of water. I'm not telling you it's a tornado or a cyclone. I don't know exactly what it is. But what we can know is this. That's some storm. That is some type of powerful storm to be looped in or lumped in with all of those other kinds of storms. And so when they say, hey, why are you afraid? I think they'd say, well, Jesus, look at the storm. Do you see what's going around all around us? Are there not storms in your life and my life that seem that great too? You know, Jesus, I've lost function in my body. Jesus, that tumor is growing. Jesus, I can't afford my rent. Jesus, I have no insurance. Jesus, my marriage is on the verge of collapse. Jesus, my son isn't going to make it. Jesus, I've lost everything. Aren't there storms in our life that seem so overwhelming that we can't help but focus on it? It's like we look at it and we become more afraid the more we focus and look at it. And we're like that person in the scary movie who there's the evil guy coming, and we, instead of running away, we just kind of sit there frozen in fear. And that's often how we can be when the storms of life come. This is a great storm. Why are you afraid? Jesus, do you see this? We're sinking. This wind is howling. These waves are crashing. Look at the storm. That might be one answer we would give. Jesus, look at the storm. But there's another one I think we might say. Jesus, why are we afraid? Well, we can't handle it. Look back at that text and look at verse 25. It says, and they went and woke him, saying, save us, Lord, we are perishing. Please remember who is included in the they. Who is included in this group of disciples? Some of these men are professional fishermen. These are men who are familiar with the Sea of Galilee. They are comfortable being in a boat on this body of water. They're familiar with storms and likely have been on a boat during a storm. And look at their reaction, because they have history and they have experience with all of the situations they're in, and yet they are riddled and crippled by fear. And that should also give us more evidence for how great of a storm this is, but also evidence to how unable they were to, or inable they were to handle it. They didn't have the ability to handle it. Have any of you followed some of the severe storms that have happened in the South the last week or two? You know, I know Little Rock got hit really hard with a tornado, and we know a lot about that in Oklahoma. But they got hit really hard yesterday. There was a really bad one this past week or two in Mississippi. Did you see the viral clip of the newscaster, of the weatherman in Mississippi? I saw it all over my social media. So this professional was on TV, and they pull up this radar where the whole state of Mississippi, or the city, it was Amory, Mississippi. It pops up white, and then a dot appears, and it's a purple circle. And on live TV, in front of what would be a national audience, he says, oh no. And he dips his head onto his forecaster desk. And on live TV, he said, "Dear Jesus, please help them." We have a lot of experience with severe weather. Have you ever heard of a forecaster doing that on live TV? When a man who watches storms professionally looks at a storm and says, "Oh no, I think that's a bad sign." When you have disciples who are fishermen, who know this body of water, who know storms, who know how to be on a boat, when they say, "Lord, we are perishing," that should tell us this is a very major storm and they have no ability to handle it. Are there not storms in our life where it feels like we just can't handle it? We can't control it. I've tried every page in my manual on how to fix this. I've went to the book. I've looked up the table of context. I've flipped it. I don't know what to do about this situation. That was the disciples, and that's us often. There are storms that come into our life that we cannot control, and we do not have the ability. We try hard. We give it our best effort. We give the attempts, but we can't do anything about it. I've tried to reconcile God, but she's dead set on leaving. I'm trying. I've tried to eat better. I've tried to be more active, but my health is still declining. I've took the treatments. I've followed the doctor's orders, but it's not leaving my body. I've tried to raise them right, but they keep making these decisions. Have you ever been in storms like that in your life where I'm trying to do whatever I think I can or know to, but it's not doing anything? And we say, "Jesus, I'm not able. I don't have the power. I'm weak. I'm worried. I'm scared. I don't know what to do, and I'm not sure I can do anything here." Why are you afraid? Well, I can't handle it. There's one more reason I think we might say too. "Jesus, it's going to destroy me. The storm is going to destroy me." What'd they say? "Master, we are perishing." God, we're going to die. We're dying here. This storm's going to overtake us easily. And there are some storms in life that make us take a long look at our mortality. We have this amazing ability as humans to know we're going to die, yet to find ways to ignore it or compartmentalize it and not think about it. Because we know we're going to die, right? From dust we came, and to dust shall we return. We know that's a fact of life, but we don't every moment of every day think about that, despite that grave thing that's going to happen to us. And yet, there are moments in life, though, where we cannot ignore that truth, where the storm is here, and I am temporary, and this could be the end. And in this moment, that's what the disciples are facing. And the wind's howling, the waves are breaking, it's shaking, the boat's taking on water. This is it for us. Our life is flashing before our eyes. And they're thinking, this is going to destroy me. And once again, are there not storms in our life that make us take a long look at our life and the fact that it will end? Aren't there diagnoses that seem fatal or final? Aren't there accidents and tragic events that take place in our lives? There's natural disasters that fit here. There's pandemics, and we've experienced that. Sometimes we lose loved ones, and the fact that they face that storm makes us think about our own life and where we are mentally with that truth. And in these moments, we are overcome with fear and emotion, knowing that our life will end, and we don't know when, but we're afraid of what's coming next. The unknown. Why are you afraid? Well, Jesus, look at the storm. Jesus, I can't handle it, and it's going to destroy me. And those are multiple responses that we might give to Jesus for why we're afraid. But notice how he finished that question. "O you of little faith." Fear is a natural emotion. As a human, you will be afraid in your life. You will have fear. But the question for us, and I believe the question for the disciples here is, who do you put your faith in when the storms do come? When you are afraid, how do you respond to it? What do you do with your fear in these moments, in these times, in these scenes in your life? So how should we respond to them? Well, I believe Jesus would have a response for every response we might give for why we're afraid. When we would say, Jesus, look at the storm, I believe Jesus would say, look at me. He'd say, look at me. When storms happen in our life, we tend to fixate our eyes on them. I remember in Moore a tornado coming through town. I know that sounds funny because there's like one every other month in Moore, Oklahoma. But I remember one that came through. And at the time, my grandma had a shelter. And what everyone did was our whole family met there. We went in her shelter because we didn't have one. And that was one of those shelters. I don't know if they still have these, but the one where the whole neighborhood came. You know, now everyone has them in their own backyard or their garage. But it was like, oh, hey, Mary, come on. And the whole street came in and somehow fit in this small little, building down below the ground. But we went down in there, except for all the men. You know what the men did? They stood and watched. I remember my uncle climbing on the fence, kind of watching the storm go by. And he didn't come down until the very last second. And I think that represents a lot of times us in our storms in life is we get our eyes fixated on it. We see the power, we see the possibility, and we stare and we focus and we see its danger. And I'm sure that's how the disciples are reacting. They see the storm and they can't help but focus on it and be afraid of it. And their eyes become fixated on it. But Jesus wants you and I in our storms of life to focus on something different. He wants us to take our eyes and look at Him. He wants us to turn our attention, all of our focus, to Him in the storm. He would say, look at me. Yeah, the storm is big, but Jesus is bigger. The storm is great, but Jesus is greater. The storm is real, and it's really close. But so is God. He is real, and He is really close. There is someone much bigger than the storm, and He's sitting in your boat. We see big problems and sometimes fail to see our big God. We sometimes get so focused on the issues around us, and we fail to see how the great big God who's sitting right beside us in our life as we walk with Him. Faith recognizes the God in the boat and focuses on Him. We've been studying James on Sunday mornings at Choctaw. And in James chapter 1, as he starts the letter, James would say, count it all joy, my brethren, when you encounter various trials, knowing that the testing of your faith produces endurance. And in chapter 1 and verse 5, he would tell them, ask God for wisdom, and He gives it generously without reproach. And what James is telling those people is you need to ask God for wisdom to see trials the way God does, to see these storms in your life the way God does. What he's really saying is you need wisdom to see God in your storm, because often we fail to see Him in it. Do we realize who's in our boat? Do we realize who's in our boat in the storms of life? Do we see God in our problems in life? Or are we so focused on the scary that's all around us? So we need to remember who's with us. We need to remember how He is everywhere, but He is here with us, and we must remember His presence in our life. When we have God's presence, we can be reassured that despite what's going on around me, He's with me. And since He's with us, we have peace. We misunderstand peace, and by we, I mean myself. I think a lot of people misunderstand peace. We think peace is the lack of conflict or the lack of trouble. And that's really not what peace is, because Jesus had peace in the most troubled times of His life. Peace isn't the lack of trouble. Peace is a state of being. It's a state of being even in the midst of trouble. With Jesus, you could have just as much peace being in a storm on a boat in the middle of the sea as you can driving down a back road on a Sunday afternoon singing Peaceful, Easy Feeling by the Eagles. You can have the same amount of peace, because it's not just a feeling of a lack of trouble. It's a state of being you have with God. You can have peace in the midst of chaos because of the one who's with you. We might be in the eye of the storm, but we have the great I Am with us. And that should provide us comfort and reassurance. And so one bit of application, something you and I need to do when we go through trials and storms, is we absolutely need to pray to God, asking Him for wisdom to see Him in our problems. Because we do not do this naturally. we focus on the storm. So one thing we need to do when we're afraid is, God, help me, give me your wisdom that I may see you in the storm, that I may see this problem, this issue in my life through your lens, through an eternal perspective, that I may see you in it and find comfort and reassurance. And that will really boost our faith and our trust in that moment. So when we would say, God, look at the storm, he would say, look at me. When we would say, God, I can't handle this, Jesus, I cannot control this, he would say, I can. I can. Look at verse 26 and 27 one more time. He said to them, why are you afraid? Oh, you have little faith? But then it says, he rose and rebuked the winds and the sea, and there was a great calm. And the men marveled, saying, what sort of man is this, that even the winds and sea obey him? He speaks the storm into stopping there, and I find it interesting that the disciples react with awe like they do, because they've been with Jesus for some time. I mean, they've seen Jesus do incredible things. Up until this point, they've seen Jesus heal lepers. He's cast out demons in the Gospel of Matthew before this. He's healed the sick. There's even a story of when Jesus met a centurion who had a servant, and the servant wasn't even in his presence physically, yet he healed him. They've seen remarkable power, yet they react in awe. And it might be because in the Gospel of Matthew, this is the first miracle where we see Jesus control nature. Up until this point, they have not seen Jesus perform a miracle that involved nature like this. So they still don't understand God's power to its fullest extent. We still don't understand God's power to its fullest extent. So they're amazed, though, that Jesus can control this water. He can control this storm. But what they would learn in that moment is where they would say, I can't handle this, Jesus would say, I can. There are many uncontrollables in life, and there are many uncontrollables in our storms, in our problems, in our trials. There are issues where we lack the ability, the knowledge, and understanding to fix it or to do something to cause it to stop. Jesus has none of our limitations. God has none of our limitations. Yeah, the waves are crashing, the wind's howling, the boat's it's gonna flip over soon. But the power of the storm does not compare to the power of the one who created it. God created the earth with the capacity to have these storms, and we get so afraid by what happens to us, yet we have a God who is far more powerful than a storm. We might feel weak and think we lack ability to control our storms in life, and we would be correct. We are weak. We don't have his ability, but he has it in excess. He can. He is able, and we can turn to him for all that we lack. We might not be able, but he is. And when we look at God in our storm, when we ask for wisdom to say, God, help me to see you in my storm, to see my storm the way you see it, that it will grow my faith, that it has something good for me in it, we need to make sure we look at him correctly. He is the God who spoke earth into existence. He is the God who breathed life into man. He is the God who parted the sea and freed his people from captivity. He is the God who crumbled the walls of Jericho by having people walk. He is the God who slays giants with small stones. He is the God who defeats the universe's greatest enemy by giving up himself. He is the God who prepared a plan before the foundations of the world and has caused it to come into being to save mankind. Does that not sound like a God who can handle our problems? Is he not big enough and powerful enough to deal with our situations? We have a God who can handle our problems, handle our trials, handle our storms. And so here's another bit of application. As we go through our storms, remember the storms God has handled. There's a reason the Israelites told stories of their past to future generations. Do you see how God has taken care of you? Keep your trust in him. We need to remember how God has provided for his people, even in their worst situations. But we also need to remember how God has taken care of us in our lives through our worst situations. There are storms that every single person in here has already gotten through in their life with God's help. Don't forget that. We need to look back at those. When a new storm comes, we need to turn around and say, but you know what? This is scary, but God's gotten me through this and through this and through this, and I've made it out okay, and my faith is still intact, and I've grown through it. God's going to be with me now. Don't forget the storms you've made it through with God's help. Don't forget all the things He's done. And let that power reassure you when you are afraid. Where we would say, I can't handle it, Jesus would say, I can. But He would also have a response to the last one. Where we would say, Jesus, I'm afraid because this storm is going to destroy me. Simply, Jesus would say, I'm going to save you. Death was never God's plan. It's all sin's doing. God has done everything throughout His existence, though, to save us from death forever. That's hard to comprehend. That God has done everything throughout His existence to save us from sin, to save us from death. First of all, we don't even know, we can't put a number on His existence. We see Genesis 1:1 and we think about the beginning, but even before then, God had a plan, Ephesians chapter 1, before the foundations of the world to save mankind from sin. God has worked everything within His power to cause that problem, to get rid of that problem, so that we could have eternal relationship with Jesus, that we could have an eternal relationship to be saved forever. And He's done everything in His power. He earnestly desires to save you and I. Now, there are questions that we cannot answer. Unfortunately, we can't answer. Will this storm be the end of me? Don't know. Will my death come from this storm or trial, or from a storm or trial? Can't answer that. Will God answer my prayer the way I desire it and remove me or save me from this specific storm? I can't answer that. You can't answer that. That's unfortunate, maybe. But here's what we can know. While we will die one day, Jesus has given His life so that we may never perish. What did they say? Master, save us, we are perishing. Isn't it ironic or interesting that the same person they're talking to said, for God so loved the world, He gave His only begotten Son, that whoever believes in Him shall not perish, but have everlasting life. That should provide Jesus' people with hope. Not a hope that's momentary, not a hope that says, well, I have hope as long as I get out of this situation or storm or problem. It's a hope that goes beyond the storm. It's a hope that goes beyond results. It's a hope that's eternal, something to cling to in the worst moments of our life. It's a hope that's eternal that we can cling to, that provides joy and peace despite outcomes. Isn't that a far better hope than one that's only predicated or is only because of the results of life? If I have a hope that's only determined by what happens in this moment, it's not a very good hope. But if I have something to cling to in my life, that no matter what happens in this season, I have something far better for me with God, that's a hope that provides joy every day of my life, regardless of what situation I'm in. With Jesus, we have something better, and it goes beyond the storm. The storm can't damage that. So another bit of application, when James would say that the designed end of our trials, of our tests and storms, is that we get a mature faith that lacks nothing, he would later say in verse 12 of James chapter 1 that blessed is the man who endures or is faithful, for when he has stood the test, he will receive a crown of life. We need to remember in our storms that our lives are not about getting out of problems. Our lives are about being faithful through them. So often I'm just concerned about, God, get me out of this situation, when I should be thinking about, God, help me to be faithful in this situation. You and I need to ask God for wisdom to see Him in the storm. And you and I need to remember His power and ability in the storm. But we also need to remember, I have something far better, and let my concern, let my focus be on being faithful in this storm and in this moment. God, help me to see eternity in this temporary situation. So why are you afraid? Well, there's a lot of answers we could give, but Jesus has a lot of responses. When the storm overwhelms you and I, may we look to Jesus. May we ask God for wisdom to see Him in the storm, and may we always remember who's in the boat with us, that He's not far, and He's awfully powerful. And when we lack ability to solve our own problems, may we turn to Him and remember what He's done throughout history, what He's done throughout our own lives, and focus on His power and ability. The most powerful being on this earth or in this universe is at our side, and we walk with Him, and He's in our boat. And when death might seem near, or life reminds you of how temporary it is, remember God's got an eternal plan for every single one of us. And that's something that provides real joy and real hope in our life. Isaiah would say, when you pass through the waters, I will be with you, and the rivers will not overflow you. So do not fear, for I have redeemed you. I have called you by name, you are mine. And that's a wonderful promise to remember in the problems of our life. I just want to encourage you today, remember that we have a God who's able and in control. We have a God who's bigger than our problems. We have a God who's with us in our boat as we travel with Him. And let's cling to that Jesus who loves us, who saves us, and cares about our storms and is right there with us in it. I hope that helps you. I hope that encouraged you today. Thank you for being here. Thank you for your attention.